"Release her," Nameless Gunslinger said to most notorious thugs in Deadwood. The Henry was cold in my hands. Not cold from the night, cold the way iron goes cold when it's been kept from use too long, 3, maybe 4 days since I'd drawn it. The barrel had a nick near the front sight from a rock I'd tumbled it against coming down out of the Black Hills, and I kept running my thumb over that nick the way a man worries a loose tooth. Standing in the dark gap between Langrisha's theater and the wall of Swearengen's place, I could feel the cold of the mud through the soles of my boots. October in Deadwood, the kind of cold that doesn't so much bite as press. I had not meant to be in Deadwood at all. The town had a sound to it, even at that hour. Later I would learn to name the pieces, the piano that never quit, the particular creak of the thoroughfare planks when a heavy man crossed them, the sound the gulch made when the wind came off the hills at an angle. That night I only knew it as a low, uneven roar, like listening to the ocean from half a mile off. I'd never seen the ocean. I only knew the comparison from a man I rode with for a season, a man from Massachusetts who talked about it the way men in the territories talked about things they'd left behind and would not get back. He was dead by the time I reached Deadwood, shot in Kansas, but the comparison stuck. I'd come down out of the hills because my horse had thrown a shoe, and because the altitude had done something to my chest. A tightness that sat behind my sternum like a man had his fist there and was squeezing, not hard, just enough to remind me. I was not a young man. I was not an old one either, but the line between those two conditions had been shifting on me for about 3 years, and some mornings it was hard to say which side of it I was on. There was a livery at the south end of the camp. That was what I wanted. Shoe the horse, rest a night, ride out in the morning before the town got loud. I heard her before I saw anything. Not a scream, nothing so clean as a scream. It was the sound a person makes when they've been past fear and have come out somewhere quieter on the other side, a kind of flat, deliberate voice, very low, saying something I couldn't make out yet, and then a man's voice over it, then 2 men's voices, and then a sound that was a hand across a face or something close to that. A flat, meaty sound with the particular quality that kind of violence has, not loud but dense. I stopped. I was still standing in the gap between buildings. The mud was an inch deep at my feet. My horse, tied at the corner post, shifted and blew through her nose. I remember looking at my hands on the Henry and noting that they were steady. That was not courage. That was just the way my hands had always behaved when a situation clarified. The rest of me had a number of opinions about what was happening. My hands had only one. I went around the corner. There were 4 of them. I understood without being told that I had come upon something organized rather than impulsive. The way they were positioned, the fact that they'd chosen this particular alley and not the thoroughfare, the fact that one of them was standing with his back to the alley entrance as a watch. He turned when he heard me. He had a wide, flat face, and he was carrying a shotgun loose in the crook of his arm. Behind him, in the yellow spill of a lantern that one of the others held, a woman stood against the back wall of whatever building that was. She was not young. She was not old. Her hair was dark and it had come partially loose on one side, hanging against her jaw. Her dress was gray wool, plain, the kind a woman wears for work rather than occasion. There was a brightness at her left cheekbone that would be a bruise by morning. She was looking at the men around her with an expression I can only describe as assessment, not defeated, not frightened beyond function, but weighing something, measuring the arithmetic of a situation she had not yet found a way out of. The man holding the lantern was big, thick through the chest, with a mustache that drooped over the corners of his mouth. He wore a coat with a fur collar that was intended to communicate prosperity and communicated instead the desperation of a man who wanted to be taken for more than he was. He was the one in charge. I had enough experience with that particular configuration of men to read it immediately. I said, "Release her." Not loudly. I have never seen the utility of being loud. The man with the flat face and the shotgun said something. I don't remember exactly what. It was a territorial kind of statement, the sort men make when they want to establish that a place belongs to them and you are in it without permission. He may have told me to go to hell. He may have told me to turn around. The specific words don't matter. What matters is that he shifted the shotgun, and I put the Henry on him before he finished the shift, and he stopped. There was a moment. Deadwood went on making its ocean sound beyond us. The lantern swung slightly in the cold air. I could smell wood smoke and something sharper, ammonia, from the horses in the livery not 50 yards away. I said it again, release her, and then I said, I won't ask a third time. I want to be accurate about what I was feeling at that moment, which was nothing particular. A carpenter feels something like that when he's setting a beam, a close attention, a narrowing down to the mechanics of the thing, a temporary forgetting of everything that isn't this immediate problem. I was not brave. I was not driven by any particular conviction about justice, though I had some of those. I was just a man with a rifle who had walked around a corner and found an arithmetic problem, and the arithmetic was manageable. What I did not anticipate was the woman. While I held the shotgun man and while the other two were working out what to do, I could see them in my peripheral vision. That sideways seeing that develops in a man after enough of these situations. She moved. Not away. Toward the one holding the lantern. She moved into him, shoulder first, low, driving her shoulder into his midsection the way you'd hit a fence post you were trying to knock loose. She was not a large woman, but she had decided on something and she committed to it completely. The lantern went sideways and dropped, and there was a moment of scrambling fire before it guttered out in the mud. I put the Henry against the shotgun man's temple. I said, tell your boys to step back. He told them. The one she'd hit was on one knee in the mud, not seriously damaged but surprised past functioning. The other had his hand on his pistol but had not drawn it, which was a correct reading of the situation. The fourth was the one who'd been standing further back. I hadn't had a full look at him, and in the dark I couldn't get one. But he hadn't moved, which meant he was either smarter than the others or more frightened. I said to the woman, can you walk? She said, I've been able to walk my entire life. It was exactly the wrong moment for a remark like that, and it was also the right one. I almost laughed. I did not because the situation did not permit it, but the impulse was there. I walked her backward out of that alley with the Henry covering the four of them, and then we went quickly around the corner and into the street, and I picked up my horse's lead from the post, and we walked north along the thoroughfare without running, because running draws attention and walking with intention usually does not. She said, where are we going? I said, away from there. She said, that isn't an answer. I said, it's the only one I have at the moment. Her name was Clara Voss. She told me this approximately 4 minutes after we put 2 blocks between ourselves and the alley, when she seemed to have decided that I was not an immediate threat and that basic information could be shared without strategic cost. She had been in Deadwood for 11 months. She had come from St. Louis, which I wouldn't have guessed from her speech, which carried nothing of the city in it, no particular softness, no aspirational formality. She talked like a woman who had worked outdoors. I asked what her business was in Deadwood. She said I had a claim. I said had. She said it's complicated. We were standing outside a boarding house on the north end of the camp by then. The sign above the door said rooms in paint that had weathered to near invisibility. A light burned behind one of the upstairs windows, and I could see the shadow of someone moving behind the glass, but whoever it was didn't come to the window. The cold had sharpened. My chest did the thing again, the pressing, the reminder. She was looking at me with an expression that had changed from the assessment look. This one was harder to name. Wariness, but wariness adjacent to something else. A person who has been in a situation where all her options were bad and is now in a situation where the options are less clear. I said, you need to go inside. She said, I need to talk to you first. I said, that can wait until morning. She said it cannot. She was right. I understood that, even if I didn't know the specifics yet. When someone's in a situation that produced what I'd walked in on, mourning doesn't necessarily improve things. I tied the mare to the post, and we sat on the 2 steps up to the boarding house door, which was not comfortable and was very cold, and she told me the shape of it. The claim was real, a placer claim in a gulch off the main creek, filed in her name after her husband had died of the fever 8 months prior. Marcus Voss. She said his name with a flatness that told me the grief was not fresh but was not absent either, just incorporated. The way a broken bone heals wrong and you learn to carry it. The claim had produced modestly, not enough to make a person wealthy, enough to make a person comfortable, and in Deadwood that was a kind of wealth. She'd been working it with 2 men she'd hired, a Swede named Olson and a Missouri man named Pruitt, who she trusted. What she had not accounted for was a man named Dutch Harlan. The name meant something to me. I'd heard it in Cheyenne, where it was attached to a story about a freight company and a type of confidence that involved legal instruments that looked correct and were not. Dutch Harlan was not the man with the fur collar. That was an employee. Dutch Harlan was the architecture behind the employee. A man who had apparently decided that the most efficient way to acquire mining interests in Deadwood was to make the current owners of those interests sufficiently uncomfortable that they chose to sell. He had, by Clara Voss's account, been making her uncomfortable for approximately 6 weeks. It had started with small things, her hired men receiving visits from men she didn't know, men who suggested that working for a widow might not be the healthiest long-term employment decision. Olson had left. Pruitt had stayed, and then 3 days ago Pruitt had not shown up at the claim and she had not been able to find him since. Then her asher had told her that he'd had a visit and that he would no longer be assaying her ore. Then, tonight, the men in the alley. I listened to all of this without interrupting. I have a capacity for listening that some people find unnerving. I stay too still, or I don't make the noises that people make to signal that they're following along. She didn't seem unnerved by it. She told the whole thing in order, plainly, with only the facts she was certain of, and without embellishment of the parts that must have been frightening. When she finished, I said, "What is it you want from me?" She looked at me directly. She had dark eyes, not black-brown, but the kind of brown that in firelight would look black. In the dim light off the street she was mostly shadow and the shape of a jaw. She said, "I want to know if you're the kind of man who stays put." I said, "That depends on the circumstances." She said, "I'm asking about these ones." I thought about that. I said, "I don't have anywhere particular to be." She said, "That isn't the same thing." She was correct again. It was not the same thing, and she knew the difference and was right to push on it. A man who has no destination is not the same as a man who commits to a place. The first kind is just drifting in a direction and can drift away just as easily. I looked at the Henry across my knees, the nick on the front sight. My thumb found it again, without my deciding to. I said, "I'll stay until the thing is settled." She held that for a moment, then she said, "All right." She went inside. I sat on the steps a while longer, listening to Deadwood do its thing, and then I took the mare to the livery and made arrangements. Dutch Harlan's man, the one with the fur collar whose name was Cobb Reardon, I learned later, came to the boarding house the next morning. I was in the front room, having had a cup of something that was called coffee and was approximately the color of river water, when I heard the knock. The woman who ran the boarding house, Mrs. Detter, opened the door, and I heard Reardon's voice asking to speak with Mrs. Voss, and I put the cup down and went to the door. Reardon looked at me and said, "Who are you?" I said, "The man who put a rifle to your man's head last night." He had the particular quality of a man who has become accustomed to a room accommodating him, an expansiveness in how he stood, a slight surprise when the room didn't accommodate him. He reassembled himself quickly, smiled. The smile was for a different audience than me. He said, "Mr. Harlan just wants to make a fair offer for the claim. That's all." I said, "She's not selling." He said, "She hasn't heard the offer." I said she doesn't need to. He looked past me, trying to see if Clara was behind me. She was upstairs. I'd told her to stay there until I came and got her, which she had accepted with an expression that communicated she was accepting it tactically rather than agreeing with the premise. Reardon said, "You don't speak for her." I said, "I speak for myself. And what I'm saying is that you ought to go back to Dutch Harlan and tell him this particular claim is going to be more trouble than it's worth." He said, "Dutch Harlan doesn't back off claims." I said, "Then he's going to have a bad few weeks." Reardon looked at me for a long time after that. I held the look without difficulty. Eventually he went down the steps and up the thoroughfare, and that was the end of the conversation. Here is what the next week was. Pruitt, it turned out, had not been harmed, he'd been paid. A sum Clara didn't know the exact amount of, paid to leave Deadwood and not come back. I located this information through a man at the hardware who talked freely in exchange for having someone listen. Pruitt had taken the money because he had a family in Missouri and no particular reason to die in Dakota territory for a widow's placer claim. I couldn't fault him for it. Clara did not fault him either, which told me something. She said, "He has children. He made the right choice for them." I found a new man to work the claim, a Cornishman named Trewin who had come to the territories after the mines in his country gave out, who had worked in silver, copper, and gold in that order, and who had the kind of quiet competence that doesn't require explaining itself. He'd heard about Harlan's operation and had his own reasons for wanting to be associated with something that was pushing back against it. He came for wages that Clara could afford, and he didn't discuss the other reasons. I hired a second man, a younger one, a kid from Iowa named Decker who'd been living at the edge of camp doing whatever work came available and eating badly. I paid him out of my own pocket, which was not deep but had something in it. He worked hard and asked few questions, which was what I needed. Every morning I rode up to the claim. The gulch was about 2 miles northeast of the main camp, up a trail that a horse could navigate but not easily narrow, with a drop on the west side that I tried not to look at directly. The creek had been worked into a system of sluice boxes and a rocker that Clara had built with Marcus in the first months of the claim before the fever. I learned to read what they'd built. It was good work. Solid. The man had known what he was doing, and the woman had learned it alongside him, and the system showed both. I am not a miner. I am not a great many things, but I can understand a system when someone explains it to me, and Clara explained the operation with a precision that I thought about more than once in the days after. Not just why the sluice was set at this angle and not that one, why the rocker needed to be worked at a particular rhythm. She had absorbed the knowledge completely, and it had become hers, not borrowed but integrated, the way a person integrates something they've worked at long enough. Harlan's men came twice in that first week. The first time was at the claim, 3 men on horseback who came up the trail and stopped at the edge of the workings. I was at the upper end of the sluice when I heard the horses. I walked down to where they were. They told me Mr. Harlan was prepared to increase his offer. I told them Mr. Harlan's offer was not under consideration. They asked me if I understood who Dutch Harlan was. I told them I had a general impression. They left. The second time was in town. 2 men I hadn't seen before came up alongside me in the thoroughfare, one on each side, and walked with me for a few steps. The one on my right said, "You ought to consider your position here. You got no stake in this." I said, "I've got as much stake as I need." He said, "A drifter with a rifle who wanders in one night and decides to play hero. How's that going to end for you?" I said, "Better than it's ending for Dutch Harlan." They peeled off at the next corner. I stood and watched them go, then went and got something to eat, which I had been meaning to do for several hours. There is a thing that happens when you've been in a situation for long enough. You stop being a person who happened to arrive and start being part of the situation itself. The line between those two states is subtle but real. I noticed it one evening about 10 days in, when I was walking back from the claim, and I saw a man I didn't recognize watching the boarding house from across the thoroughfare, and my reaction was not the reaction of a stranger who'd noticed something odd. It was the reaction of a man whose territory was being watched. I didn't examine that too closely at the time. What I was examining instead was the situation with Harlan's legal instruments. The Cornishman Truan had a friend, a man who'd worked in Virginia City, a former Asir who'd run into trouble with Harlan's operation there and had been watching it from a distance ever since. Through Truan, I arranged to meet this man. His name was Aldous, and he was a thin, dry-spoken man who reminded me of a schoolteacher who'd seen too many things and revised his understanding of people accordingly. Aldous told me that Harlan's method was not crude. He said, he doesn't jump the claim. He doesn't need to. He puts pressure on the support system, the hired men, the Asirs, the buyers, until the owner becomes isolated and then makes an offer at a fraction of value. When the owner refuses, the pressure increases. When the owner is a woman alone, the pressure takes different forms. He said he's done it 6 times that I know of, 3 of them sold. 2 of them are gone from the territory and I don't know where. 1 of them. He stopped, he looked at the table. I said, what happened to the 6th one? He said she had a claim about 12 miles east of here. She held out for 5 months. Then there was a fire. He said it the way you say something when you've said it enough times that the horror of it has been abraded down to fact, which didn't make it less of a fact. I said, does anyone in this camp have legal standing against Harlan? He said, the law here is complicated. I said, I understand the law here is complicated. I'm asking if there's a mechanism. He said, there's a federal marshal who comes through periodically. He's honest, which is unusual. If you could document what Harlan's operation has done in specific enough terms, affidavits from the men who were paid to leave, a record of the interference with the Asir, the incident in the alley, there's a case. Whether the case produces anything before Harlan produces a fire is a different question. I thought about the woman on the step, the arithmetic she was running, the way she'd driven her shoulder into Reardon's man without hesitation when she found the opening. I said, how long before the marshal comes through? Aldous said, 3 weeks, maybe 4. I started collecting the documentation. This turned out to be the real work, not the standoffs, not the mornings on horseback up the narrow trail, but the patient and unglamorous accumulation of specific facts. I tracked down a man in a camp 15 miles east who'd been paid to leave his assaying operation. He didn't want to put his name to anything at first. I sat with him for 2 hours in his current camp, which was mean and cold compared to what he'd had in Deadwood, and I talked about it plainly. What it would mean to have Harlan operating without consequence, what it would mean to his business to have him stopped. He signed the paper. I found 2 of the men Harlan had paid to leave the claims he'd previously absorbed. One was in Deadwood still, working wages at a mill. One was in a town 40 miles south, and I rode there and back in a day that my body spent the following morning complaining about in specific and detailed language. Clara wrote the affidavit about the alley. She wrote it at the table in the boarding house front room, in a hand that was small and level, with a legal specificity that surprised me. I said, you've written documents like this before. She said, my father was a county clerk in Indiana. I spent 3 years copying deeds and affidavits before I married Marcus. I know what a legal document needs to say. I said, that's useful. She said, I'm full of useful things. You'd know that by now if you asked questions. I said, I don't ask many questions. She said, I've noticed. She said it without heat, a neutral observation. She had a way of making neutral observations that I found I kept turning over, examining, the way you examine a rock that has an interesting weight. The night Reardon came back with 6 men was a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because Mrs. Detter had made a particular thing she made on Thursdays, a kind of baked pudding with the dried fruit she got from the merchant on the second block, and I had eaten it and was thinking about it when I heard the boots on the boardwalk outside. Multiple sets. The kind of irregular percussion of men who are not keeping step, who are moving with purpose but no discipline. I was at the window with the Henry before they stopped. 6 men. Reardon was in front, 2 of them had shotguns, the rest had rifles or pistols. The one with the flat face who'd been on watch in the alley was there, which meant his relationship with the Henry at his temple had not produced the degree of caution I'd hoped for, or he'd been compelled back into service by someone he was more afraid of than me. Reardon called my name, not my real name, he didn't have it. He called what he'd taken to calling me, which was Drifter, which I took as accurate if not particularly respectful. He called it to the building generally, not specifically to the window I was watching from, which told me he didn't know exactly where I was, which was useful. What happened next was not a grand confrontation. I want to be honest about that, because the story is easier to tell when violence is dramatic and complicated, and this wasn't. I called down through the window for them to identify what they wanted. Reardon said Dutch Harlan was exercising a legal right to inspect the claim documents and wanted Mrs. Voss to produce them. I said the claim documents were with the federal recorder and could be inspected at the federal recorder's office during regular hours. He said he wanted to speak with Mrs. Voss directly. I said Mrs. Voss would speak to Dutch Harlan when a federal marshal was present, and not before. There was a considerable pause. During this pause, Trewin and Decker came around the north end of the building. I'd sent them out the back when I heard the boots, with instructions to get around to the flanks. They weren't invisible. I hadn't asked them to be. I asked them to be visible from the right angle, which was the angle Reardon was standing at. Reardon was a man who could count. 6 men, and then his view adjusted to include Trewin with a long gun and Decker holding something that was not precise but was pointed. Reardon said, "This isn't finished." I said, "I know it. Come back when the marshal's in town." They went. I came downstairs. Clara was standing at the foot of the stairs with one of Mrs. Detter's fireplace pokers, not a gun, because she'd told me once she didn't keep a gun, which was something I'd been intending to address and had not yet. She had it in her right hand, held loosely. She was wearing the gray wool dress she'd been wearing the night in the alley. The bruise on her cheekbone was still visible, yellowing at the edges. She said, "How many?" I said, 6, they're gone. She said, "For now." I said, "For now, yes." She set the poker down against the wall. She had a way of standing feet a certain distance apart, weight slightly forward like a person who spent years in work that required balance. She looked at the door and then at me. She said, "What you told them about the marshal, about the documents, that's real." I said, "Yes, 3 weeks, maybe less." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Why?" I said, "Why what?" She said, "Why are you still here? You said you'd stay until the thing was settled, but you came around that corner not knowing anything about the thing. You had no reason to, and you've been here 2 weeks. You've spent money you didn't have to spend. You rode 40 miles in one day to get a man's name on a paper. Why?" It was a legitimate question. I had been keeping myself somewhat busy so as not to spend too much time with it. But she was asking it directly, at 10:20 on a Thursday with a poker resting against the wall behind her, and she had a right to the answer. I said, "Because the situation was wrong and I was the one standing there." She said, "That gets you around the corner. It doesn't get you 2 weeks." I said, "No." She waited. I said, "I've been in a lot of places and there's not many of them where something I did mattered past the morning. I don't say that as a complaint. It's just the arithmetic of a drifting life. You do something and then you move, and the thing you did settles back into the place like water into a footprint. I wanted to see this one through." She said, "That's still not all of it." I said, "No, it's not." I was looking at the floor when I said it, which was not characteristic of me but felt correct for the occasion. The floor was rough pine, badly fitted, with gaps that let cold up from underneath. I looked at it for a moment, and then I looked at her. I said, "You're a woman who drove her shoulder into a man twice your size in the dark when she found the opening. You ran an operation alone for months after your husband died. You wrote a legal affidavit with the kind of precision that a county clerk would be satisfied with, and you did it in 20 minutes. You're not a woman who was waiting to be rescued. You're a woman who needed a particular resource at a particular moment, and I happened to be the resource." I stopped. Then I said, "I find that I'm reluctant to stop being useful to you." It was perhaps the most I'd said in a single go in years, maybe longer. The words felt clumsy coming out because I was out of practice, but they were true, which is a thing I've found compensates for clumsiness at least partway. She looked at me, not assessing, not calculating, just looking. The lamplight from the front room was behind her, and I was mostly seeing her in silhouette and the shape of her face. She said, "I find I'm not in a hurry to have you go." She reached out and set her hand on my forearm. Not reaching for my arm, just setting her hand on it lightly, the way you'd set something down you were going to pick back up. Her hand was rough, work-roughened. It was warm. I had not been touched that way, that particular combination of deliberateness and ease, in long enough that I didn't immediately know what to do with it. I didn't do anything with it. I just stayed still, which was, in the circumstances, exactly the right thing. The marshal came in 19 days. His name was Braddock, and he was a tall man with a quiet demeanor and the particular efficiency of a person who has learned to do a great deal in a short time, because he is always working against the clock of his own departure. I laid the documentation out for him at the table in the boarding house front room. Clara sat at the other end of the table. She answered Braddock's questions directly and without elaboration, which he seemed to appreciate. He read the affidavits carefully. He asked about the night in the alley. He asked about the Thursday with 6 men. He looked at the paper from the man in the camp 15 miles east. He said, "This is more than I usually arrive to find." I said, "We've been expecting you." He spent 2 days in Deadwood. He interviewed Aldous, whose memory was specific and damning. He located the Missouri man, Pruitt, who had returned to Deadwood. I'd written him to come back, told him the situation had changed, told him I'd cover his travel, and Pruitt signed a second affidavit describing what he'd been paid and by whom. Dutch Harlan was in Deadwood during those 2 days. I saw him once, not Reardon, the man himself. He was smaller than I'd expected from the scale of his operation. A compact man with a gray suit and the eyes of a person who has learned to calculate distance very precisely. He looked at me when I passed him on the thoroughfare. I looked back. Neither of us said anything. On the second day, Braddock arrested Reardon on the strength of the alley affidavit, and 3 of the others on conspiracy charges that I did not fully understand, but that Braddock explained in competent and confident terms. Harlan himself he could not arrest. The law at that distance from the action was not sufficient, but he delivered a formal notice that put Harlan's operation under federal scrutiny in a way that would, Braddock said, make it very difficult for him to continue in the territories. He said he'll move on. Men like this need targets that don't push back. You've made this one expensive. Clara thanked him. She did it plainly without effusion. He said he was doing his job. She said, "You did it well." He seemed to appreciate that. The night after Braddock left Deadwood, there was a first snow. Not a storm, just the season announcing itself. A few hours of light flakes that settled on the thoroughfare mud and on the rooftops and on the trails out of camp. By morning it had mostly melted, leaving the world with a rinsed quality, the dirt cleaner, the air sharp enough to feel like a fact. I was on the boarding house steps, the same 2 steps, same cold boards when Clara came out. She had a cup in each hand. She set one beside me without being asked and sat on the upper step, which put her slightly above me, which I didn't think about consciously but somehow felt correct. We drank the coffee, which was better than it usually was. Mrs. Detter had gotten a new supply of something from the merchant, and whatever it was approximated the real article. Clara said, "What will you do now?" I said, "I haven't decided." She said, "That sounds like a man who's going to leave." I said, "It sounds like a man who hasn't decided." She looked out at the thoroughfare, where Deadwood was beginning its daily roar. A dog crossed from one side to the other carrying something. Two men in heavy coats walked north, talking without looking at each other. The light was flat and gray and clean. She said, "The claim will produce through the winter with the right management. Trewin knows what he's doing. But there's work that needs doing outside the sluice operation, repairs on the equipment, a new section of sluice that Marcus had planned before he got sick, a better trail up to the gulch that a wagon could use." She said it with her eyes on the street, not looking at me, giving me room to hear it without it being a direct ask. I said, "A wagon trail would be useful." She said it would. I said, "I know something about grading trail, did some of that in Nevada." She said, "I didn't know that." I said, "You don't know a lot of things about me." She said, "No, but I find that I'm interested." She turned and looked at me when she said it, direct, the way she did everything. Not soft, not performing something, just a woman telling you a true thing because she decided to. I held that cup in both hands. The warmth of it was specific and immediate in the cold air. I thought about Massachusetts and the ocean I'd never seen. I thought about the nick on the front sight of the Henry, which I'd been meaning to file down for 3 days and hadn't. I thought about a map of the territories and all the places in it that were not here, and I tried to feel the pull of them. I couldn't feel it. I said, "You'll want to draw out the wagon trail before the ground freezes deep. Once it's locked up, you can't grade it until spring." She said, "I know that." I said, "So we should start this week." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she put her hand around her cup the way she'd set it on my arm that night, that deliberate ease, nothing performed, and she said, "Yes, we should." The snow had left the rooftops white. Somewhere up the camp a bell was ringing, the one they rang at shift changes at the bigger operations. Deadwood went on making its sound. The dog crossed back the other way, still carrying whatever it was carrying. The air smelled of snow and coal smoke and the creek. I drank my coffee. I was not going anywhere. I want to say something about Deadwood that doesn't usually get said, which is that it was loud in a way that was personal. Most loud places are loud at you, at your ears, at your attention. Deadwood was loud in a way that felt like it was conducted through the ground itself, through the mud and the boards and the walls of whatever you were standing in. Even in the dead of night, when the worst of it had quieted, there was a vibration. I slept badly the first 3 nights, not because I was frightened, but because I could feel the place the way you feel a room where something recently happened. It had that quality. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping through it. I thought about that later, how a place can stop being strange if you stay in it long enough. How the noise becomes context instead of interruption. How you stop noticing the smell of the gulch, the quality of the light in the late afternoon when the sun hit the gulch walls at a specific angle and turned everything briefly amber. I was not a man who usually thought about things like that. But I had time, those mornings coming down from the claim, to think about things I didn't usually think about. One morning Clara rode up to the claim instead of staying in town. She did this without announcing it, which I would come to understand was characteristic. She appeared at the head of the trail on a black horse with a blaze that was shaped like a bad hand of cards, and she had a coat I hadn't seen before, a heavier one, dark green, with the collar turned up. She tied the horse beside the mare and walked down to the sluice and watched Trewin and Decker work for a few minutes, then walked up to where I was. She said, "Alson is back." I said, "The Swede who left." She said he heard through someone that the situation had changed. He wants to come back if I'll take him. I said, what do you want to do? She said he's a good worker. He left because he was scared, not because he was disloyal. Those are different things. I said they are. She said I'll take him back. I said Truan won't like it. She said Truan doesn't have to like it. He just has to work alongside him. If he can't do that, then he can say so, and I'll tell him that's his choice to make. She said it without heat, as a statement of the operational facts. I found myself thinking that Marcus Voss, whoever he'd been, had been a lucky man. We stood at the upper end of the sluice for a while. The creek made its sound. A hawk was working the thermals above the far side of the gulch, making slow circles with a patience I admired. Clara watched it too. She said, Marcus loved this place. I always thought he loved it more than I did at first. He had a romanticism about the land that I didn't share. I was more interested in whether it would produce. But I've been up here enough times now that I think I understand what he was seeing. I said, what was he seeing? She said, the scale of it, the fact that it didn't care about him. He liked things that were indifferent to his presence. He said it was restful. I said, that's an unusual thing to like. She said, he was an unusual man. She said it warmly. The grief was there in it, not sharp, just present, like I said, a thing she had incorporated. We went back down to the workings. She spent 2 hours there, checking the sluice angles, asking Truan questions about the ore quality and the recent runs, making notes in a small leather book she kept in her coat pocket. I watched her work and didn't say anything unnecessary, which was my general policy, and which she seemed to find acceptable. On the way back down the trail she said, do you have a name? I said I have one, I don't use it much. She said, is there a reason? I thought about it. I said, when I was younger I did something I'm not proud of, not criminal, nothing with a warrant to it. Just something that caused harm to people I shouldn't have caused harm to. I put some distance between myself and the name afterward. The distance became a habit. She said, do you want to tell me what it was? I said, not today. She said, all right. She didn't push on it. That restraint cost her something. I could see that she was curious, the way she held the reins a little tighter for a moment, but she let it lie, which was its own kind of grace. We rode the rest of the way to camp without talking, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. There was a night in the second week when something happened that I don't know how to put in the right order, so I'll just put it down as it was. I was outside the boarding house near midnight, sitting on the steps as I sometimes did when the chest was giving me trouble and I wanted the cold air, which helped for reasons I didn't understand but had verified enough times to trust. The camp was quieter at that hour. The piano in Swearengen's place had gone to an intermittent kind of playing, the pianist taking breaks. The street was empty except for a dog and a man who was not entirely upright making his way south. I heard the door behind me. Clara came out in a coat thrown over what she slept in, which I didn't look at directly. She sat on the upper step. She had a blanket she'd brought, which she arranged around her shoulders. She said, I saw the light was out in your room. I said, I come out here sometimes. She said, I know. I've seen you before. She'd seen me before and hadn't said anything about it, which was its own statement. She sat with me for a while without saying anything. The cold was the particular Deadwood cold, wet underneath, dry above, both at once. The kind of cold that works on you slowly. She said, what is your chest doing? I said, the altitude. She said, you should see the doctor here. He's actually competent, which is unusual. I said, I'll think about it. She said, that means you won't. I said, it means I'll think about it. She pulled the blanket tighter. She said, my father had something similar. Not altitude, he'd never been anywhere with altitude, but a tightening. He lived with it for 20 years after the first time it made itself known. He was careful with it, and it didn't take him. I said, what took him? She said, a horse. He was 64. I said, I'm sorry. She said, he had a good life. He was married to a woman who loved him for 40 years. He did work that he thought mattered. He got to see me before he died, and the last thing he said to me was that he thought I'd turned out well. She said the last part with a quietness that was not grief exactly, more like something she held carefully because it was valuable. I said he was right. She looked at me. I was looking at the street when I said it. I didn't turn to look at her. She said, you don't give compliments easily. I said, no. She said, that means the ones you give carry weight. I said, I suppose that's one way to look at it. She stayed a while longer. Then she said she was cold and went inside. I sat on the steps for another half-hour, listening to the camp settle, watching the sky go through its slow rotations. The chest wasn't giving me as much trouble by the time I went in. The day before Braddock arrived, Reardon made one more attempt. This one was not a confrontation. It was a note, delivered to the boarding house by a boy of maybe 12, who said a man had given him a coin to bring it. The note was addressed to Clara and said that Dutch Harlan was prepared to offer twice the assessed value of the claim, and that this offer would expire with the week. It said the offer was made in good faith, and that Mr. Harlan hoped all parties could arrive at a peaceful resolution. Clara read it at the breakfast table. Then she folded it precisely along its existing creases and set it in the middle of the table as if placing it for examination. She said, he's worried. I said, he knows something's coming. She said, how? I said, a man like that has people who tell him things. He'd know a marshal was due through. He'd have done the arithmetic on what we might have assembled. She said, and this is his last quiet move before things become loud. I said, that's my read. She picked up the note again and looked at it. Then she said, twice the assessed value is still half what it's worth. I said, yes. She set the note down again. She said, write him back. Tell him the claim is not for sale at any price. I said, you want to write him, not me. She said, you have better handwriting. She was right about that, which was a strange thing to be right about. I had learned to write in a schoolroom in Ohio, and the man who taught me was particular about the formation of letters, and it had stuck. I wrote the note. Clara read it over and said, that will do. She sent Mrs. Detter's son to deliver it to Harlan's man at the hotel where he was staying. That afternoon, Braddock rode into Deadwood. After Braddock left and the snow came and went, the camp felt different. Not quiet, Deadwood was never quiet, but with a different quality to the noise, like a room after an argument that's been resolved. The same furniture, the same walls, but the air changed. Alson came back to the claim 3 days after the arrests. He was a large man, nearly 6.5 feet, with hands that looked like they'd been made for a larger species. He arrived with his hat in those hands and said something to Clara in a mixture of English and Swedish that I mostly followed. She listened to the whole of it and then said, "You're back. Start Monday." And she walked away from the conversation, which was its own kind of mercy, not making him stand there in his contrition any longer than necessary. Trewin took it with the practical equanimity of a man who'd been in enough difficult situations to know that the people around you are what you have. He and Alson were not warm to each other in those first days, but they were functional, which was what mattered. Decker stayed. I'd been half expecting him to move on once the immediate situation was resolved. He was young, the camp had other opportunities, and there was nothing particularly binding him to the claim. But he stayed, and when I asked him why, he said, "This is the best work I've found here. Mrs. Voss is fair and the operation makes sense. I'd rather be here than somewhere random." It was a sensible answer, the kind a young man gives when he's surprising himself by developing good judgment. I started on the wagon trail on the 5th day after the snow. The ground was passable, not yet frozen to depth, and I spent the mornings with a shovel and a mattock working out the worst of the gradient on the middle section of the trail, where the slope was steep enough to make a loaded wagon dangerous. It was the kind of work I knew in my body. The reading of land, the understanding of where water would go, the angle that a team could hold without sliding. I had done this in Nevada, as I'd told Clara, and before that in Colorado, and it came back the way physical knowledge does, not through thinking but through doing, the hands and feet knowing things the head has to remind itself of. Clara came up most mornings. She would work the claim with the men for several hours and then come and watch the trail work for a while, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just watching. She had a surveyor's eye. She'd point out things I'd missed, a section where the grade I'd cut would collect water and freeze, a tree root that would heave the surface in spring. I revised accordingly, which she never commented on directly but which I understood she noticed. One afternoon she picked up the spare mattock and worked alongside me for an hour without asking or being invited to. She was stronger than she looked, which by then I'd stopped being surprised by. We worked without talking much, and when we stopped to rest, she sat on the bank I'd cut and looked back down the length of the trail. She said, "Marcus wanted to do this. He said it would change everything about how we worked the claim if we could get a wagon up here. He never had time." I said he had good ideas. She said he had many of them. He was better at ideas than at follow-through. I was better at follow-through. Between us it worked. She said it plainly. Not dismissive of Marcus, not aggrandizing herself. Just an accurate account of a partnership. I thought about what it took to be accurate about someone you'd lost, to hold both what they were and what they weren't, without letting grief dissolve the specifics. I said, "You've thought clearly about a lot of things most people wouldn't be clear about." She said, "I've had time." I said, "That doesn't always help." She said, "No, it doesn't, but I had good things to think about along with the hard things. I think that helps more." The trail was passable for a light wagon by the end of November. Not finished. Finished would take another week of work in the spring, but functional. The first time Truan drove the ore wagon up it, slow and careful, with Alson walking alongside the near horse and talking to it in Swedish. I stood at the top and watched them come and felt a particular satisfaction that I didn't try to name. Clara was beside me. She watched Truan bring the wagon around and set the brake and climb down, and Alson said something to him and they both laughed at whatever it was, and she said, "There it is." I said, "Yes." She said, "Marcus would have loved seeing this." I said he'd have known it was coming. He planned it. She looked at me when I said that. Something moved in her face that was not sadness exactly, though it was adjacent. More like recognition. The kind you feel when someone says a true thing you haven't been able to say yourself. She put her hand through my arm, not holding, just through. The way a person does when they're standing beside someone and want to acknowledge the standing. Her shoulder was against my arm, and the cold was around us, and Truan was talking to the horse now, the way Alson had been, and the wagon sat on the trail that Marcus had planned, and that I had cut, and that would move ore down the mountain for as long as anyone wanted to work the claim. I didn't move. I just stayed where I was, which is a thing I had been getting better at. The gulch held the last of the afternoon light the way a bowl holds water, amber and specific, and the creek made its sound, and the camp below us made its sound, and it was all one thing, and I was in the middle of it, and I wasn't going anywhere.